Okay, Year 11. So in this lesson, we are looking at the responses to tropical storms, and we're going to be focusing on Typhoon Han. So just a quick recap, Typhoon Han happened on the 8th of November in 2013 at 4:40 local time. And the reason that we still choose to focus on Typhoon Haiyan is because it was travelling at least 196 miles per hour and there were over 6,000 deaths. So in the last lesson, we looked at the primary and the secondary impacts of tropical storms. And in this lesson, we're going to be looking at immediate responses, so what happens straight away to try and save lives, and then long-term responses, so what they do a few months later to try and get the country back to what it was before the tropical storm and to try and improve it so that if a tropical storm happens again, they won't be in the same position. So here we are in relation to this topic. So we are coming to the end of tropical storms, and then we're going to be moving on to weather hazards in the UK. So before we move on to look at the specific case study examples, I would like you to first of all do this activity. So this uses information from the previous lessons. So there's 4 pictures, A, B, C and D. So decide which is the worst impact. Is it shown in A, B, C or D? Then describe what you can see and then say why it's the worst impact. So is it a short-term impact? Is it a primary impact, a secondary impact? Is it a social, economic, environmental, political impact? And what consequences will it have? And then think about how a government or on a local scale, a group of people, or on a global scale, how different people such as like aid or non-governmental organisations can come together and help improve this impact. So pause the video here and do that first. Okay, so what we're going to be doing in this lesson is looking at 4 responses. The immediate responses, then we're going to look at long-term responses. So it might be worth, you're going to be making basically 4 little spider diagrams. So you might want to make get an A4 piece of paper, and the first one, you might want to split your page in half and have immediate responses on one side and then long-term responses on the other side. So the first immediate response we're going to look at is evacuation and shelter. Now, an immediate response is important because it's what they do instantly. So within the first 24 hours to try and reduce deaths. So they're trying to save lives. Okay, so the first immediate response is that they had evacuated over 800,000 people, and they put a lot of these people into a refuge stadium in the city of Tacloban. There were over 1,200 stadiums, but the one stadium that they put the people in became a death trap. So I just want you to write all these things down first and then highlight them. Is this a good response or is this a bad response? So you might want to make a key and use 2 colours, and then I'll go through this information in a little bit more depth. So the president televised a warning and authorities evacuated over 800,000 people. And they were put in 1,200 evacuation centres where, so these were set up all over the country. And this, as a result, reduced death rates. However, as you can see on the screen on the board, still 6,190 people died. So why? Well, they put them into a refuge stadium in the city of Tacloban, and you can see this here. So this is the city of Tacloban, and they put them in the stadium because it was large enough to be able to hold on to lots of people. But the problem with it was that even though it was safe enough to withstand the strong winds, so you can see it's made of reinforced concrete, so the wind speeds of 196 miles per hour would have meant that the stadium didn't collapse. However, they didn't account for a storm surge. So a storm surge is when we get a large amount of water coming in from the sea after a tropical storm, and that flooded the stadium. So even though these evacuation centres were holding lots of people and rehousing them because their houses have been destroyed, it eventually became a death trap. And in the basement, which was on the ground floor of the stadium, so that was below ground level, a tsunami-like swirl of water came in and killed a lot of the people that were seeking shelter in here. So please, can you make sure that when you're annotating the immediate response of evacuation and shelter, you're writing down, maybe in 2 different colours, why this was good and why this was bad. Okay, so the next immediate response that we're going to look at is emergency aid. This is still like the same as the previous one we looked at. It still happened within the first 24 hours, or they tried to allow it to happen in the first 24 hours. Otherwise, more people are going to die. So make sure you write down the things on the board and then pause the video, and then we can go through it in more detail. Okay, so you can see that the Department for National Development in the UK gave them £77 million in aid. So £77 million in aid was given to this country to help them recover. However, you'll notice that it took a long time for this money to arrive. So everything then as a result was delayed. So even though they were able to supply water for 650,000 people, food for 325,000 people, and blankets and health services for 65,000 people, because it took 3 days to arrive, a lot of people started to panic. It took too long. So because there was a lack of food and a lack of services, a lot of people started to loot. So they started to essentially steal from the shops. And as a result of that, 8 people were killed. So, you know, it allows you to think, if the emergency aid came faster within the first 24 hours and not 72, would those that looting have occurred? Would that stampede have occurred? And would those 8 people have died? You'll also notice at the bottom that people in remote areas were left without food and water for even longer. And that was because there was a lack of information from the rural areas. So those areas that weren't as connected to the city, they didn't have any way of communicating with them. So they went without food for a very, very long time. And as a result, they started drinking from polluted water sources, which could have then led to an increase in those with cholera, which will obviously then lead to more deaths. Okay, so make sure when you're writing down all these facts, you are deciding whether you think it was a positive factor for the emergency responses, or you think actually it wasn't that good. Okay, now we're going to move on to the 2 long-term responses. So the first one we're going to look at is cash for work. So remember, the purpose of a long-term response is to try and get the country back to how it was before the typhoon occurred. And it's also to try and make the country actually better, so more developed and more prepared in the event of a typhoon happening again. So you'll see that there was lots of the Cash for Work programme paid local people, so people that live there, to get involved in street cleaning, in removing the debris from the road, which is what you can see on the image on the screen, in rebuilding houses, mangrove clearing, and boat repairs, because the coastal areas were affected the worst. However, there were lots of negatives to this, as you'll see from here that not all members of the society could get involved. So if you were elderly, if you had members or families in the government, or if you had a disability, or if you were under the age of 18, you were not allowed to partake. So your other family members or your neighbours might have been able to remove all of the debris from the road for money, and you would have had to do it for free. So that caused a lot of tension between the government and the local people. However, you know, because people were getting paid if they'd lost their job or they didn't have any money to buy resources to try and, you know, start their lives again, this was an opportunity for them to spend money, to gain money, and to restart the local economy. You'll also notice from the final section that it says the minimum wage was paid by NGOs. So remember, our NGOs are a non-governmental organisation. So this Cash for Work scheme was a non-governmental organisation scheme, and they essentially paid those local people a wage that was higher than they would have been getting if they would have been working in a shop or a local business. So, you know, that was good for the people that were getting paid this money. However, when they then went back to their original job, they were wanting then a pay rise, but the local businesses couldn't compete with that. So that caused then tension between this non-governmental organisation and the local businesses, because they were not being able to give them as much money. And then a lot of people actually, you know, said, I don't want to work for you anymore if you can't give me a pay rise. So that caused a lot of tension. It gave people jobs in the short term, cash for work to clean up. But then once all the cleaning up had been done, they didn't have a job anymore. Okay. So let's move on to the final one. So this is the Build Back Better scheme. So the Build Back Better scheme is our second long-term response. And this is similar for the cash for work in the sense that they gave people money to do a job. But this was more for the long term, so improving the houses and the infrastructure in the Philippines, so that if a typhoon such as Typhoon Haiyan occurred again, the buildings would be more sturdy and there would be less destruction along the coastline because people weren't allowed to build there. So in 2014, so this was a year after Typhoon Haiyan occurred, the Philippine government declared that it was working towards the country's long-term recovery. So the Build Back Better scheme was an intention so that buildings were not just rebuilt as they were before, so they weren't built again from non-sturdy materials such as like plastic and like softer wood, but they were upgraded. They were built from stronger materials that would be able to withstand these typhoon-like winds. And the intention was that they would be protected then from future disasters. You'll also notice here that they also encourage people to not build along the coastline. So local settlements, such as mostly those that worked in the fishing communities, they were told that they couldn't move back to their local areas, which caused a lot of tension because it displaced a lot of the eastern settlers. So, you know, they were told they couldn't move back there, so they were moved elsewhere. However, a lot of the places that they were moved to weren't very fertile. So the land that they were put on wasn't very fertile, which meant that if you were a farmer or if you were growing lots of crops, the land wouldn't have been as effective or efficient, so you wouldn't have been able to grow as many crops as you would have been able to on the previous land, which meant that their source of food and income could no longer be reliant on one crop. They had to grow a variety of different crops to try and make the same money. Now, you're probably thinking, well, you know, they were given a new house, they were given a better house, and they were given money to build the house. Why are they complaining? And the scheme had the same mantra, a house for a house. However, they had a lack of consideration for the people's livelihoods. So they were moved out of their local communities, their jobs weren't the same anymore, and they had to adapt and change how they worked. And it caused a lot of conflict between the locals and the government. So even though it did give them new jobs and a new life, it wasn't as it was before, and this caused people to feel a little bit isolated and not part of that community anymore. So make sure when you're going through the Build Back Better scheme, you're highlighting in two separate colours to look at why it was positive and why it was negative. Okay, then what I would like you to do is have a go at this exam question. So using a named example, evaluate the immediate and long-term responses to tropical storms. So our named example would be Typhoon Haiyan, which happened in 2013. When we're talking about the immediate responses, we're talking about the first 24 hours. So we'd refer to emergent evacuation centres. And also we would refer to emergency aid. And then the long-term responses is what they did in the months afterwards. So you could talk for the cash for work scheme and the Build Back Better. Okay, so what I've done here is I've put together some sort of writing frame for you. So you can see this very start is our introduction or load, the L section. Then we have the O paragraph on the one hand, so why we agree that the immediate and long-term responses were effective. Then we have the A for alternative, so they weren't very effective. And then we have our D, our decision. So make sure, please, that you in these sections, because you're talking about why it was beneficial, and then you're saying how it wasn't beneficial, so you're making sure that you are evaluating. So pause it here, have a go at this, and then I will put the answers or an example of this question on the slides. Okay, so what we have here are some examples of what you could have said. So please make sure that you pause the video here and go through in green pen. You'll notice that I haven't done a conclusion, and that's because there's no right or wrong way for your conclusion as long as you give evidence to back it up. And if you're being one-sided, you're not then giving evidence from the other side because it's not necessary in the conclusion. So pause it here, green pen your work, and then that is all the activities for this lesson.